The invitation to host Thanksgiving dinner had been Mom's idea, though she presented it as doing me a favor. "Since you're so proud of your little apartment," she'd said over the phone, "maybe it's time the family saw how you're really living." I should have recognized the trap. In 28 years, my parents had never once shown real curiosity about my home or my life beyond the surface details they liked to criticize. But this time, I let myself feel hopeful. I finally had something undeniable to show them. A stunning two-bedroom apartment in Harbor Heights, one of the most sought-after neighborhoods in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. Polished hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sun, granite countertops in a kitchen designed for entertaining, and a panoramic harbor view that real estate agents like to describe as million-dollar worthy. At night, the water reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds, and sometimes I would stand there alone just to remind myself how far I had come. What my family didn't know, because they had never cared enough to ask, was that I had spent the last 4 years building something real. I worked in property management and real estate investment, starting with modest residential units that most people overlooked and slowly expanding into a carefully structured portfolio. Long hours studying market trends, negotiating acquisitions, running investment analyses, and reinvesting profits had turned into something substantial. The Harbor Heights apartment wasn't a lucky break or a flashy rental. It was part of a broader strategy, a calculated step in a plan that was still unfolding. But to them, I was still the directionless middle child who had walked away from law school. Growing up, I had always carried the invisible label of family disappointment. My older sister, Rebecca, was the golden child, the doctor whose achievements were framed and hung on every wall. My younger brother, Kyle, was the engineer, steady and respectable, following a path that made sense at dinner parties. And then there was me, the one who supposedly never figured things out. When I left law school to pursue real estate, Dad reacted as though I had announced I was dropping everything to join a circus. "Real estate?" he'd said with barely concealed disdain, as if the words tasted unpleasant. "That's not a career. That's what people fall back on when they can't succeed at anything else." From that moment on, every holiday, every birthday dinner, every casual gathering carried subtle reminders of their verdict. Comments about unstable commissions, jokes about market crashes, questions about when I would finally settle into a real profession. They assumed I was scraping by, maybe showing apartments or collecting rent checks for someone else. I had tried, at first, to explain acquisitions, portfolio growth, leverage strategies, asset appreciation, but their attention would drift within seconds. They had already written my story in their minds. Anything that contradicted it was inconvenient. Harbor Heights felt different. This was the kind of address that commanded respect without explanation. Doctors lived here, corporate executives, attorneys, entrepreneurs with names that appeared in business journals, the sort of people my parents admired and bragged about knowing. I thought if they walked through my front door, saw the view, the building, the details, something inside them might finally shift. Maybe they would realize that success doesn't always look like a framed diploma. I spent 2 full days preparing for Thanksgiving. I ordered an expensive organic turkey from a specialty market across town. I selected imported wine after researching vintages Dad would recognize. I picked up artisanal desserts from the bakery Mom had once mentioned loving during a casual conversation years ago. I scrubbed every corner of the apartment until it gleamed. I arranged fresh flowers in the entryway and dining room. I set the table carefully with the good china I had been collecting piece by piece, waiting for an occasion that felt important enough to use it. I wanted everything to be perfect. Not to impress them, I told myself, but to prove something silently. They arrived an hour late, which was so predictable it almost felt rehearsed. Dad stepped inside first, scanning the space with the cautious suspicion of someone expecting to uncover a deception. His eyes moved from the lighting fixtures to the furniture, lingering like he was calculating costs and inconsistencies. Mom wandered slowly from room to room, brushing her fingers across surfaces as if checking for dust or flaws. Rebecca and Kyle exchanged glances that suggested reluctant admiration, though neither of them wanted to say it outright. "Nice place," Kyle finally admitted, standing by the window and staring out at the harbor. "Must cost a fortune to rent." "Probably splitting it with roommates," Dad interjected before I could respond. "That's the only way someone in your situation could manage an area like this." I opened my mouth to correct him, but Mom cut in smoothly. "Where should we put our coats? Somewhere out of the way when your roommates get home?" "I don't have roommates. I live here alone." Dad gave a short, disbelieving snort. "Sure you do. What are you paying, $3,000 a month? That's more than some people's mortgage payments." "I'm not paying rent, actually." "Subletting, then?" Rebecca said confidently, as though she were solving a simple equation. "That would explain it. Probably found someone desperate for a temporary arrangement." The certainty in her voice drained the energy from me. I could have explained ownership structures, equity positions, or investment returns. I could have walked them through numbers and documents, but I knew it wouldn't matter. So I stopped trying. I turned back to the kitchen and focused on finishing dinner, telling myself that actions would speak louder than explanations. Let them believe whatever fit their narrative. Eventually, the truth would be impossible to ignore. As the meal unfolded, however, the atmosphere tightened instead of softened. Dad swirled his wine and made a comment about people who try too hard to impress with labels. Mom questioned whether the turkey was genuinely organic or simply overpriced marketing. Rebecca delivered careful observations about individuals who stretch beyond their financial limits to project a certain image. Each remark was delivered lightly, almost playfully, but the edge beneath them was unmistakable. By the time dessert was served, it was clear that no view, no address, no perfectly set table was enough to override the version of me they had already decided to believe. The breaking point came during dessert. I'd bought a beautiful tart from Delacroix-Passy, the same bakery where Mom always bragged about getting Rebecca's wedding cake. Cost $80, but I wanted everything to be perfect. "This is good," Kyle said, taking a second bite. "Where did you get it?" "Delroy-Passy," I said, hoping Mom would recognize the name. She did. "That place is incredibly expensive. How much did you spend on this dinner?" $1,000? $1,500? I wanted to make it special. "With what money?" Dad's voice got sharp. "You're living in an apartment that probably costs more than I make in a month, buying groceries that cost more than most people's car payments. And you expect us to believe you can afford this?" "I can afford it. My business is doing well." "What business?" Rebecca laughed. "You work for a real estate company. You're an employee, not a business owner." I tried to explain about property investment, about building equity through strategic acquisitions, about how real estate could generate passive income. But Dad was already shaking his head. "Real estate investment." He said the words like they tasted bad. "You mean flipping houses, scamming desperate sellers. That's not investing, that's gambling." "It's not flipping houses. I buy rental properties." "And with what money?" Mom demanded. "You didn't have any money when you dropped out of law school. You didn't inherit anything. So where did you get the capital for these supposed investments?" I could have shown them my portfolio spreadsheets, my bank statements, my property deeds, but something in their tone told me it wouldn't matter. They'd already decided this was all some kind of elaborate scam or delusion. "Maybe we should talk about something else," Kyle suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But Dad wasn't done. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor view. "You know what I think? I think you're in debt up to your eyeballs. I think you're renting this place month to month with credit cards, buying expensive food with credit cards, and playing dress up in a neighborhood you can't afford." "Dad, that's not—" "Don't lie to me." His voice got louder. I've seen this before. People who can't handle money getting in over their heads, pretending to be successful until the whole thing comes crashing down. You're headed for bankruptcy, and you're too proud to admit it. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom was nodding along with everything Dad said. Rebecca looked embarrassed, but not contradictory. Kyle was studying his dessert plate like it held the secrets of the universe. I sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. They'd come to my home, eaten my food, enjoyed my hospitality, and concluded that it was all evidence of my moral and financial failure. "I'm not in debt," I said quietly. "Then prove it," Dad challenged. "Show me your bank statements. Show me your income documentation. Show me how someone with your job history can afford to live like this." Before I could respond, he was walking around my living room again, but this time with the demeanor of a detective gathering evidence. He picked up mail from my side table and started reading return addresses. "Harbor Heights Property Management," he read aloud. "Probably your landlord sending eviction notices." "Dad, please don't." "Metropolitan Investment Group. Debt collectors, I bet." He was getting worked up now, his voice rising with each piece of mail. "City of Harbor Heights Tax Assessment Office, probably threatening liens on property you pretend to own." Mom joined in, examining my bookshelf. "Look at all these real estate books, property investment strategies, building rental income, real estate portfolio management. She's been reading get-rich-quick schemes." "Those aren't get-rich-quick books. They're fantasy," Rebecca said with the certainty that comes from a medical degree. "People who actually have money don't need to read books about how to get money." Dad had moved to the kitchen and was opening my cabinets, like he expected to find evidence of my deception hidden behind the cereal boxes. "Everything here is too expensive for someone in your situation. The cookware, the appliances, even the coffee maker. You're living a lifestyle that doesn't match your income level." "Maybe that's because you don't know what my income level actually is." "I know exactly what real estate agents make," he said dismissively, "and it's not enough for this." "I'm not a real estate agent. I'm a property acquisition specialist and portfolio manager." He waved his hand like he was brushing away a fly. "Fancy titles don't change reality. You're living beyond your means in a neighborhood where you don't belong, and sooner or later it's going to catch up with you." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because of how confidently he said them, how certain he was that I was failing, despite all evidence to the contrary. "You're too broke for this neighborhood," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of my apartment. "Stop pretending you belong here with successful people. You're embarrassing yourself and embarrassing this family." Mom nodded emphatically. "We didn't raise you to live a lie. Find an apartment you can actually afford and stop this charade before you ruin your credit permanently." I kept eating my dessert quietly, letting their words wash over me. Part of me wanted to pull out my laptop and show them my property management software, my investment portfolio, my monthly revenue reports. But a bigger part of me realized it wouldn't matter. They'd find a way to dismiss or minimize anything I showed them. "Are you even listening to us?" Rebecca asked. "This is serious. You could lose everything." I looked up at her. "I'm listening." "Then why aren't you responding? Why aren't you defending yourself?" "Because you've already made up your minds." Dad returned to the table, his face flushed with frustration. "We're trying to help you. We're trying to save you from making a mistake that could ruin your life. But you have to be honest with us about your situation." "My situation is that I'm a successful property investor who owns multiple rental properties and lives comfortably within my means." "That's delusional," Mom said flatly. "People like you don't become successful property investors. That takes money, connections, experience, things you don't have." "People like me," she gestured vaguely. "People who couldn't finish law school. People who've never held a stable job. People who don't understand how money works." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Everyone turned to look toward the entrance. "Expecting someone?" Pal asked. I wasn't, but I was grateful for the interruption. I'll see who it is. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A middle-aged man in a business suit stood in the hallway holding a folder and checking his watch. I didn't recognize him, but his professional appearance suggested he wasn't a random visitor. I opened the door. "Can I help you, Miss Chin?" "I'm Robert Martinez from Harbor Heights Property Management. I apologize for stopping by during the holiday, but we had a maintenance emergency in Building C that requires your approval for the repair costs. The contractor needs authorization tonight to start work tomorrow morning." I could hear my family's conversation stopped completely behind me. The silence was so absolute that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Of course," I said. "What's the situation?" "Burst pipe in Unit 12C, flooded 3 apartments. The water damage is extensive, and we need approval for emergency repairs, plus temporary relocation costs for the affected tenants. The estimate is about $40,000 for repairs and another $15,000 for temporary housing." He handed me the folder. As I opened it and reviewed the documentation, I could feel my family's stares boring into my back. "This looks reasonable," I said, signing the authorization forms. "How long before the tenants can move back in?" "About 2 weeks if we start tomorrow. I'll coordinate with the insurance adjuster and keep you updated on the progress." "Perfect. And, Robert, make sure the affected tenants know we'll cover any additional expenses they incurred during the displacement. Hotel, meals, laundry, transportation, whatever they need." "Will do. Thank you for the quick response, Miss Chin. Happy Thanksgiving." I closed the door and turned around to face my family. 4 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. "Who is that?" Dad asked, his voice much quieter than it had been moments before. "The property manager for Harbor Heights." "Property manager for what?" "For the building and the 3 adjacent buildings." The silence stretched out for what felt like minutes. Rebecca was the first to speak. "You mean you manage those buildings?" "I own them." More silence. Dad sat down heavily in his chair, still holding a piece of mail from my side table. "You own this building?" Mom said slowly, like she was testing the words. "And the one next to it, and the 2 across the street." Kyle leaned forward. "When you said you weren't paying rent, I meant I'm not paying rent. It's hard to pay rent to yourself." Dad looked down at the mail in his hand, the envelope from Harbor Heights Property Management that he'd assumed was an eviction notice. "What's this, then?" "Monthly revenue reports, occupancy rates, maintenance schedules, profit and loss statements." He opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper. His eyes moved across the numbers, and I watched his expression change from skepticism to disbelief to something approaching shock. "This says monthly rental income of—" He stopped and looked up at me. "This can't be right. $43,000 in November?" It was a good month. We had high occupancy and minimal maintenance costs. Rebecca grabbed the papers from Dad's hands and started reading. Net profit after expenses, $28,000 for 1 month? Like I said, it was a good month. Mom was staring at me like I just revealed I was an alien. "How long have you owned these buildings?" "I bought the first one 3 years ago. The others I acquired over the past 18 months as they came on the market." "With what money?" Dad's question came out as barely a whisper. "I started with a small down payment on a duplex in the University District, lived in one unit, rented out the other, used the rental income and my salary to save for the next property, repeated the process, gradually moving up to larger properties with better cash flow potential." I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out a folder I kept there. "These are the property deeds. Harbor Heights, buildings A through D, all owned free and clear as of 6 months ago." Kyle took the folder and started flipping through the documents. "Free and clear? You mean no mortgages?" "The cash flow from the first 3 buildings generated enough income to buy the 4th building outright. Debt-free ownership was always the goal." Dad was still staring at the revenue reports. "You make more in a month than I make in a year. Some months are better than others, but yes, the business has been successful." The room fell quiet again. I could see them all processing this information, trying to reconcile their assumptions about my failure with the evidence in front of them. Rebecca was the first to recover. "Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling?" I tried to tell you multiple times, but every time I mentioned property investment or real estate business, you dismissed it as gambling or get-rich-quick schemes. But you could have shown us documentation, Mom protested. You could have proved you were successful. When would have been a good time to prove myself to people who had already decided I was a failure? At Christmas dinner when you lectured me about finding a real job? At Rebecca's birthday when you introduced me to her friends as the one who couldn't finish law school? At Kyle's graduation when you told people I was still figuring things out? They exchanged glances, and I could see the uncomfortable recognition in their faces. They remembered those conversations differently than I did, but they couldn't deny the pattern. Dad sat down their revenue reports and looked around my apartment with new eyes. So, all of this is paid for with income from my real estate portfolio? The furniture, the art, the kitchen appliances? All purchased with money I earn from properties I own. And dinner tonight was expensive because I wanted to celebrate Thanksgiving with my family. I can afford expensive dinners now. Kyle was still reading through the property deeds. These buildings are worth millions, about $12 million in total, according to the most recent appraisals. Mom sat down like her legs had given out. $12 million? The business is worth more than the buildings themselves. The rental income, the long-term leases, the property management contracts, it's a complete real estate operation. Rebecca shook her head slowly. And we just spent 2 hours telling you that you're living beyond your means and that I'm embarrassing the family by pretending to belong in this neighborhood. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This was the silence of people realizing they'd made a fundamental error, not just in facts, but in judgment. I think, Dad said finally, I owe you an apology. You owe me more than that. He looked up, surprised by the sharpness in my voice. You owe me an explanation. You owe me an explanation for why you assumed the worst about me for years, why you never asked detailed questions about my work, why you dismissed every attempt I made to explain my business, why you decided I was a failure and then interpreted everything I did through that lens. Mom started to say something, but I held up my hand. I dropped out of law school because I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. But instead of asking me what I did want to do, you decided it meant I was directionless. I started working in real estate, and instead of asking me to explain the industry, you assumed it was a dead-end job. I bought my first property, and instead of congratulating me, you warned me about getting in over my head. Rebecca cleared her throat. We didn't understand. You didn't want to understand. Understanding would have required admitting that maybe I knew something you didn't. Maybe the family disappointment had actually found something she was good at. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor view, the same view Dad had been admiring earlier while telling me I couldn't afford to live here. Do you know what the hardest part has been? Not building the business, that was just work. The hardest part has been succeeding while my own family was rooting for me to fail. Do you know how isolating it is to achieve something you're proud of and have nowhere to share that pride? Kyle set down the property deeds. We weren't rooting for you to fail, weren't you? Every family gathering, you all seemed disappointed that I wasn't struggling more, like my success was somehow inconvenient for the narrative you'd created about me. Dad was staring at his hands. We were worried about you. We thought you were making poor decisions. Based on what evidence? Based on actually looking at my financial situation? Based on asking detailed questions about my business model? Or based on the assumption that because I didn't follow your prescribed path, I must be failing? The questions hung in the air unanswered because the truth was they'd never looked for evidence. They'd made their assumptions and stuck with them, filtering everything through their preconceptions. Mom wiped her eyes, and I realized she was crying. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. I know you are, but sorry doesn't undo 4 years of being treated like the family charity case. Sorry doesn't give me back the family support I needed when I was building this business. Sorry doesn't erase the constant stress of knowing that my own parents thought I was a failure. Robert Martinez knocked again, and I went to answer it. He handed me another set of documents. Emergency repair approval for Building D, he explained. HVAC system failure. We need to replace the entire unit before tomorrow, or the tenants will be without heat over the weekend. I reviewed and signed the authorization for another $15,000 in repairs. After he left, I turned back to my family. That's how my business works, I said. Problems come up, decisions need to be made quickly, and tenants depend on me to solve them. It's not gambling or get-rich-quick schemes. It's real business with real responsibilities. Dad stood up and walked over to me. Can you forgive us? I looked at him for a long moment. I can forgive you, but I can't forget how this felt, and I can't pretend that everything goes back to normal now that you know I'm successful. What does that mean? It means that maybe we need to rebuild our relationship from scratch. Maybe you need to get to know who I actually am instead of who you assumed I was. Rebecca joined us by the window. We'd like that. We'd like to know who you really are. I smiled for the first time all evening. I'm someone who owns 4 apartment buildings and makes more money in a month than most people make in a year. I'm someone who employs 12 people and provides housing for over 200 families. I'm someone who built a business from nothing and now has enough financial security to afford $80 desserts without thinking twice. And Kyle added, reading from one of my business cards he'd found on the side table, "You're the CEO of Harbor Heights Property Group." I'm also someone who invited her family for Thanksgiving dinner because she wanted to share her success with the people she loves, even when those people spent the evening telling her she was living beyond her means. We stood there looking out at the harbor as the sun set over the water. The view really was worth millions. I should know since I'd had it appraised. Can we start over? Mom asked quietly. We can try. Dad picked up one of the property deeds again. Would you be willing to tell us about your business? Really tell us. I mean, help us understand how it works. I'd like that. And for the first time in years, I meant it. The validation felt good, but what felt better was the possibility that maybe, finally, my family might see me for who I really was instead of who they decided I should be. Later that evening, after they'd left, I stood in my apartment that I owned, in my building that I owned, in my neighborhood where I definitely belonged, and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time with my family. I felt proud.